In 2022, two superfans of actress Ana de Armas watched the trailer for the film yesterday, which features the object of their affections in a prominent role, prompting the two to spend money on renting the film, only to find Ana de Armas nowhere in the movie's final product. It turns out the subplot featuring a character played by Ana de Armas was left on the movie's cutting room floor, and with it, all of the actress's screen time. And despite that development, a glimpse of the character still got slipped into yesterday's trailer, priming fanboys of Havana's sweetheart to seek compensation for their wasted money and disappointment, taking Universal to court for false advertising. The case settled on undisclosed terms, and while it didn't end the way the plaintiffs desired, it did start a conversation around erroneous marketing in the film industry. Because as frivolous as the case sounds, I sympathize in that I'm disappointed when I wake up and Ana de Armas isn't present in my apartment, let alone if I paid $3.99 on the promise of her contribution to a movie. So was it dishonest to show her in a trailer when she wasn't in the final film? Is it within reason to shrug off that she was cut late enough in production that this was an honest mistake? Maybe the trailer needed to contextualize the curse of fame prevalent in the narrative with the doe-eyed gaze of a well-known celebrity, even if that shot isn't literally representative of the final product. Do the studios have the right to use content they've created, but may not ultimately utilize as they initially intended for marketing if it's their content to use how they please? Did some small part of those execs know they were bamboozling anyone who might be beguiled by the visage of Ana de Armas? I think there's a lot more to unpack than one might think. I love trailers. I'm an antsy schmuck who's always looking ahead to cool stuff that's coming up next in the cultural zeitgeist, and I even cultivate a YouTube playlist of my favorite retro commercials alongside trailers for movies, games, and shows that are on their way and I'm excited for, so I can have my own personal little ad roll I can play between streaming movies and shows at home, my personal theater bumpers at all times. But a folly of being such a sucker for the corporate culture of commercialism is quite frequently that commercials are meant to be more enticing than they are representative of a product. The execs kinda don't care if you're disappointed. Your money is already in their pocket if you bought it. On the other hand, it's equally common for a very good product to have lousy marketing. It's a double-edged sword, and no small part of the fun of discussing film and media is discussing how advertisers serves it or otherwise. Our attachments to our favorite stars and actors can be so strong, and that's something advertising can utilize against us. And the Ana de Armas debacle is case in point to that, and yeah, I felt similarly after I saw Argyle. What's my girl Dua Lipa doing front and center of the marketing when she's only in the movie for what felt like less than 3 minutes? I don't need to really question when I paid to see it because I was manipulated plainly by that very factor. It's not technically lying to say Dua Lipa is in the movie, but when she's marketed so prominently only to turn out to be a minor character at best, it comes off as deceptive, and it's pretty easy to do the math as to why that happens. But it's not just yo-yos like me with shameless celebrity crushes that are ripe to be tricked by a misleading trailer. After all, who better to dupe into seeing your movie than an unsuspecting child? As was the case of Kangaroo Jack, a movie released in 2002 with a trailer that heavily showcases a hippity-hopping, talking kangaroo.
Love the jacket, Charlie. Nice. I said a hip hop, the hippie to the hip hop, and you don't stop the rock to the bang bang boogie set up. Jump
this is great. Directed by David McNally.
I'm Jackie Legs, and I'd like to say,
an utterly unremarkable film. Kangaroo Jack would not exist to this day if its cultural footprint didn't entirely surround its marketing. The film, in truth, was a lighthearted buddy caper with a kangaroo vaguely involved. The titular Kangaroo Jack was the only angle that anyone could seem to base the movie's identity around, to the point that ads would surround him entirely, including scenes of him talking, which would turn out to be, in the context of the film, a hallucination sequence that only lasts a sparing moment. Meaning millions of American children have the distinct memory of being catfished by a wacky rapping kangaroo into seeing a lousy Coen Brothers knockoff. That said, this may have been easier to forget if it hadn't happened twice within a year, nearly to the day. Disney released Snow Dogs in 2003, which hangs its hat on the same throne of lies Kangaroo Jack did, showcasing wisecracking huskies in its trailer, only to turn out to be a relatively grounded, boring dog sledding comedy with a single dream sequence where the dogs talk.
You really stuffed in it this time.
Disney's Snow Dogs.
And I sympathize because, yeah, how else will you get kids amped about Cuba Gooding Jr. inheriting a pack of huskies and having to choose between that and his dental firm? But I think everyone involved here knew what they were doing, and it's hard not to think of it as a bit scummy. It's the easiest line of thought in the world. Handed a crappy movie, the only thing a bunch of suits could think to do was, more or less, stretch the truth. It's craven, self-interested, and in practice, wildly successful. Because frankly, the 1-2 punch of the disappointment of these movies is the only reason everyone remembers them, which can only indicate people went to go see them to be disappointed by them. So in a sort of twisted way, Kangaroo Jack owes its continued cultural memory, puny as it may be, to its widely panned, erroneous ad campaign. Snow Dogs, following Jack's footsteps, tripled its budget at the box office. The bottom line is all that really matters to the suits who make the advertisements. The dent left in the culture by either or both of these films probably wouldn't add up to more than a hill of beans if they weren't marketed so sagaciously. So the ad execs, insidious as they were, kinda won the day. This was in an era where kids liked movies. Kids these days would rather stream from home or scroll one of their TikTok feeds. Their patience for childlike whimsy is at an all-time low. I don't say that to begrudge anyone, I'm just stating the facts, which are that even Gen Zers who work in film admit themselves they can barely stand to watch film. It's more room for me in the back row of the Alamo Drafthouse every week, and it's just the fact of the matter. Enthusiasm for cinematic experiences, especially among young audiences, is at an all-time low. And so I've noticed kids' movie trailers don't rely on tricks of promising something that's not there. In fact, it strikes me that modern kids' movies want to hide the fact that they're kids' movies, since things like talking animals and raucous songs are largely seen as cringe by the skibbity toilet generation. When marketing execs are handed something particularly lighthearted or campy, they may cut a trailer that covers up those more jovial tones. Kids disappointed in a prior generation that Kangaroo Jack doesn't talk, today we have kids expecting to see the next Marvel and getting wacky theatrical hijinks. A video of an entire crowd not realizing this year's Mean Girls musical was a musical to audible disgust is a pretty solid distillation of that. Musicals are seen as campy and corny and are seen as a risky thing to be forthcoming about in marketing. To be fair, I have reservations as to how authentic this particular video actually is, but I think it still says a lot that I was aware a Mean Girls musical movie was in production, and watching the first trailer for it, I was genuinely lost as to if this was supposed to be a Mean Girls musical. Olivia Rodrigo plays over this first trailer in the stead of any Broadway original music.
What's this?
Similar confusion occurred last year with Wonka, a truly bizarre first showing as its trailer had a confused identity. Warner didn't want to show any of the songs that, frankly, make up the bulk of the movie. Viewers, yours truly included, thought it looked awful, because we didn't know it was just a kid's musical. The trailer had none of the show tunes, and what's actually a Paddington-esque romp with catchy songs, well worth belting in an IHOP at midnight, looked like some chromey, corporate, don't you remember Ghostbusters Afterlife slop, preying on nostalgia for the old classic movies. Most people who saw and liked Wonka just enjoyed it for being a straightforward, fun musical, a descriptor the trailer didn't want you to go in and expect. It's a bizarre time and market, juggling movies that are too serious to pretend don't have rapping pets in hoodies, and movies you want desperately to hide are meant to speak to children. All of this is to say, marketing is practice meant to make you, the consumer, wind up feeling like you're on top when the reality is rarely that. This is coming from a guy who loves putting on retro snack ad playlists. The task of marketing is to put lipstick on a pig, no matter how porky, and little is more gratifying as a consumer than crying false advertisement when you're disappointed, feeling like you're owed $10 because Regina George sang, the Snow Dogs didn't actually talk, or Ana de Armas wasn't in the movie you shelled out for. Where this gets complicated is when the entitlement inherent to consumerism butts heads with artistic intent. Just as well as a necessary evil to sell a movie, marketing sometimes becomes tangled into the efforts of the artist's voice. Take Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, which arrived in cinemas with urgings that late admission to the feature would not be allowed or tolerated. Hitchcock's demand was that every audience see Psycho from the very beginning, largely in service to his masterful foreshadowing and character work, which he didn't want to waste on some bozo wandering in 10 minutes late with a plate of nachos. But imagine what a pull this notion was. A movie demanding your undivided attention. I have to imagine that's no small part of what made Psycho such a cultural phenomenon. I do feel it sets a precedent that artists run a huge risk by feeling strongly about controlling the expectations of their audience. And quite frequently, the only medium where they can directly impact that is a work's marketing. And this is where the matter can get a little muddy in the relationship between artist and consumer. Take James Cameron, who created one of film's most iconic characters in 1984, the Terminator, played by none other than Arnold Schwarzenegger, the titular villain made for a memorable movie monster of sorts through Cameron's decisive shooting and creative decisions in concert with Schwarzenegger's steely robotic performance. Terminator was one of the biggest movies ever, and you'd think it'd be a safe bet to just rinse and repeat that winning formula in the sequel. The trailers for T2 made it look as though Arnie was the villain yet again. So imagine the shock felt by crowds in 1991 when the Terminator opens fire defending John Connor from a new villain instead of opposing him. This bait and switch is brilliant, one of the things that makes T2 one of the best sequels ever, as Robert Patrick's search for John Connor can be read as him trying to protect the boy and resembles a rehash of the first movie in opposition of the Terminator played by Arnold, only for the character to be fully recontextualized when battle with Arnold exposes Robert Patrick as the wicked T-1000, completely flipping the paradigm of everything we've seen so far, when those expectations were based on what we knew about the first movie and how the marketing of this one set us up to believe in that. Cameron tailored the trailers of Terminator 2 to assure this early game twist didn't get spoiled. They laid out the premise of one good and one bad Terminator, but the imagery obscures which role was left to Arnold and which was left to Patrick. And since Arnold was the villain last time, very few suspected otherwise.
One programmed to destroy. The other programmed to protect.
And it paid off as Judgment Day was a gargantuan success. And while that can be chalked up to it being one of the essential action movies of the genre's golden age, it was its misleading marketing, not unlike the kind people start lawsuits over today, that begot that result. A trailer has to give a taste, but leave an audience wanting more and enough security to buy in past that first glimpse. An audience member has to be assured their time and money is worth the experience, but be left something to be surprised by. Cameron's tactics in marketing the Terminator were a wild success, but not everyone who followed his footsteps saw the same embrace. Hideo Kojima, creator of the Metal Gear video games, cites Terminator 2's switcheroo as the main inspiration behind his own marketing of Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty. Kojima is known for feeling video game trailers spoil too much and often misleading audiences on purpose, the most infamous instance being the adverts for Sons of Liberty, focusing almost entirely on the first game's protagonist, Snake, showcasing him as if the game would simply be his next adventure. People who bought Sons of Liberty completed the prologue in Snake's shoes, only to quickly find the game's point of view shift to a brand new protagonist, Raiden, with whom you would follow the bulk of the remainder of this experience. Kojima successfully held that Metal Gear 2 wasn't really Snake's game, but what resulted were people who felt strongly that if they paid for a game about Snake, they should have gotten it. And while from a distance Sons of Liberty is lauded as a terrific game, it took a long time for the reputation of it and Raiden himself to recover from the disappointment felt when he took center stage. No matter how good Sons of Liberty is, it's hard to deny Kojima used the goodwill garnered by the popularity of Metal Gear Solid 1 and a main character as iconic as Snake to pull the wool over the eyes of his consumer. And yet, if that's the painting Kojima wanted to present, who are we to dictate what we're entitled to from a piece of art? Expectations are no small emotion of what we approach art with, and just as art can be intended to excite, touch, or anger, art can be made to shock and subvert, too. And to do this meaningfully, maybe some misleading marketing is required now and then. After all, what better way could there be to make a viewer feel the same anxiety a cast of characters does than by putting them in a position where they're just as surprised by the absence of someone promised? This saw two attempts in recent years, both sanctioned, fittingly, by reboots on Netflix. Both Masters of the Universe Revelation and Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, which I'm about to spoil part of, both, you've been warned, are continuations of familiar worlds with big fan bases that were looking forward to spending more time with the characters they've come to know. Which is why both fan bases broke a little when both of these series had opening episodes that involved their main characters vanishing. He-Man and Scott were both pulled from the pilot and ostensibly, for all we knew, killed, if not vanquished someplace else, leaving Tila and Ramona Flowers more or less the main characters of the early runs of both series. If you have any experience with male-dominated fandom and how they feel when their favorite characters are supplanted by women, I'm sure you've already surmised that everyone was very normal about these developments. But both of these shows managed to kinda have their cake and eat it too, as the disappearances of both their respective heroes have lasting consequences on the narrative and leave some worthwhile ripples until the appropriate time for both characters to be brought back arrives. But for some, that may have been too little, too late. If either of these shows drew you in on He-Man and Scott Pilgrim, you'd go a handful of episodes without He-Man and Scott Pilgrim. The question comes up again, was the effective gotcha of them being benched within the first episode worth alienating someone squarely looking forward to their appearances? Even if they both showed up later on, it's not like they were set up as the main characters and then killed off fully. This is where I posit big spoilers for the video game Danganronpa V3. Another chance to skip ahead if you feel like I jilted you on He-Man and Scott Pilgrim. You really don't want to hear this one. Okay. The Danganronpa games see the player take the position of a high schooler trapped with their genius classmates, only promised freedom from their captor if they kill one another and get away with the murder in a class trial. As the main hero, your job is to solve the crimes and expose the perpetrator among your peers, saving yourself, but also damning the guilty party to execution. As you can guess by the premise alone, no small appeal of Danganronpa is how the cast naturally narrows. Nobody is safe as you pick up clues and question suspects, fully aware your favorite character could be next to die, no less caused by your investigation. The third installment, Danganronpa V3, pushed this envelope even further, as the marketing poised the new protagonist, Kaede Akamatsu, as the new player character, the avatar with which the player would solve class trials, just like Makoto and Hajime in the first two games before. It's wearing these expectations that the player delves in and gradually uncovers clues that indicate an unfortunate truth. The player is the murderer, more or less by accident, and gradually over the course of the first class trial, the position of main character swaps from Kaede to Shuichi, who has to begrudgingly expose the death of his classmate was the fault of the character you were playing as. This truly amps up the notion of no character being safe, because even the one you played from the point of view of suffers an unprecedented removal from the narrative by an absolutely brutal execution. Before you carry on the rest of the game as a new hero with no clue if even he is safe, let alone any other classmate you dare get attached to. This was a brilliant way to engross a player base even further into a premise they were 2 games deep into. When you run out of ways to shock a player, there's no higher stake you can tackle by literally killing them and leaving no space to undo it. But it did kinda suck for anyone hoping to experience a Danganronpa game with the series' first mainline female protagonist. A protagonist switch in a movie is one thing, but your played character in a video game is what entices you to what the game hopes will be hours of gameplay. No small part of choosing what game I want to play next is settled by if I find the character I possess appealing. So if you dropped the full price on Danganronpa V3, only for the character you were excited to play as to get ushered off stage and replaced, that's gotta be jarring, which I acknowledge is an experience folks were vocal about, and one I can't really oppose, even as someone who thinks Kaede's death is one of the most important masterstrokes of Danganronpa V3's subversive structure. All of this is to say, every aspect of trailers are kind of against you. Execs are trying to peddle something as something else, and the auteurs behind the project find it in their interest for their message frequently to bamboozle you. And the end game is whether to positive or not, that change of you being tricked. At this point, you have 2 choices. You can refuse to be tricked, feel entitled to exactly the experience you walked into, demand a refund, vote with your word of mouth. Don't try something before you skim the summary on Wikipedia. Ask every question you could possibly have on message boards, so nothing catches you by surprise. Wait for movies to hit streaming, so everyone who got excited to see it in theaters can go through the trouble of experiencing it for you. In fact, stop leaving your house altogether. Subsist on nothing but the safest base nutrients. Just watch Columbo on repeat from the safety of a cellophane bubble. Does that sound fun? Or is there some small part of us that likes taking a chance on something, even if it costs us at the end of the day? A feeling like a roll of the dice when you swear the trailers and word of mouth for something made you vow to your friends, this will be Best Picture, even if you pull out your phone after and hit that 3.5 stars on Letterboxd. Even if you wait in line outside of GameStop at midnight for a hot launch title, only to boot it up and realize, oh wait, Mario dies? Within reason, I think people like the dance we do with media in this way a lot more than they let on. Because if we knew exactly what we were getting, there'd be nothing worth exploring. And while the practice of misleading trailers can be troublesome, it's the dice we roll for the thrill of seeing just how close our expectations are, and the euphoria when that pays off. Sometimes you expect to enjoy a fillet of fish real cheap, and you get cedar plank bluefin. It's so much easier to remember when we feel duped, but I bet if you considered the opposite, the time an advert hiding its best qualities made the experience fresh and chill-inducing, you'd recall just as many instances. And next time you get mad your favorite actor went underused in a movie you saw, take a moment to recall that this very same surprise could have been the magic trick that surprised and really won someone else over to a new favorite. And that's not something I would deprive anybody